Hi there, everybody. Good morning. It's really my pleasure to work with you guys today on this presentation that's called Designing Online Learning and What Makes for Effective Learning. So I've geared this primarily to the K through 12 segment, but there are principles that we'll talk about as we go through here that are specifically appropriate to any of those who are with us from the collegiate area, and we'll just kind of take it away. You'll see on the screen there's a tiny URL. It's tinyurl.com/Drost online learning. If you'll either type that into your browser or click on that, that's going to allow you to follow along in this presentation. It's a permalink, so you'll always have access to the slides, but I would ask you to make sure you do that because there's going to be things I'm going to ask you to click on, and it's just easier if you click on it rather than me trying to post it in the chat box or things of that nature as we go forward today. When you get there, it'll ask you to go ahead and put a name in. That way it just identifies you on my screen. You can choose to put an email address in if you'd like, but you don't have to. So I'm going to paste that into the chat box if you don't want to type that in, but feel free to go ahead and access that link, and I'll know you're there in a second because it's going to go ahead and tell me that. I see Nathan's in, I see Karen's in. And that URL is tinyurl.com/Drost online learning. Ziad, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I see you're in. Got two more people there. Aaron, you're now in. Glad to know I'm pronouncing that correctly. Kay, you are now in. Good to see you. All right, Darnice, you're now in. Alrighty, as people are going ahead and starting to pop into that, I'm going to head to my slide 2, which talks about what we're going to actually talk through today. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to examine what makes an online course effective. And whether you're using a blended learning approach or a full online experience, these principles are really the same when it's all said and done. So we'll talk about that. Then from there, we're going to say, okay, there are certain courses that happen to be online, but then there's other courses that just kind of blow our minds and they really show outcomes for students. And we're going to talk about how do we get to those points. And that really becomes the intersection of 3 areas of research. One is called the MOVES Informative Assessment, and that's research that was done by Decor, Homework, and myself. Then from there, we're going to look at some Harvard pieces and parts, which is called Making Thinking Visible, and those pieces and parts and how they intersect. And then from there, we're going to look at digital assessment and how that intersects into all 3 of these areas, because what we found through doing research on courses, not only here in Ohio pre-COVID and during COVID, it's by using these principles and these strategies that we're going to talk about that we actually really start to see student engagement increase as well as student outcomes being produced by our learners when it's all said and done. So that being said, I'm going to ask you to start with a chat box activity here. So you'll see here that on the screen, I have an introductory module for the course, and we're going to do what's called a notice and wonder. And we're going to start with just the notice part, and I'm going to pull this up full screen here for you in a minute. That's a screenshot from one of the courses I teach. And what I'd ask you to take a minute and look through, and I'll make it bigger again in a second, is what do you notice when you see that? That's the introductory module. So when learners first come in, that's what they see. So I'm going to just ask you to type out in the chat box, what are all of the things that you see when this welcome comes up? So I'm in my learning management system right now, and you'll see on the screen, this is my welcome module. We'll talk about module 1 here in a minute. Those are all of the things that the learner first sees. So take a minute, look on through that. What do you notice? Chat that out in the chat box for me. So I see people typing out things like it's easy to identify where to start. There's just titles and not a lot of words. That's true. Bite-sized information tells you how to interact. Somebody writes, it's a lot of work to do, a bit overwhelming. It's more of a checklist of tasks. That's true. It starts with learner communication, definitely important. There's a logical order, there's a flow, yes. Many multiple formats of files, definitely. All right, so we've got some different ideas that are put there, and those are kind of what I call the facts. Those are the things that you can actually observe when it's going on there. So, and I want you to take a minute, I want you to think about looking at that same screen or maybe one of the ideas that your peers have gone ahead and shared out. What does that make you wonder about now? Go ahead and type that out in the chat box. What do you wonder based on what you see on the screen or what other people have typed out for you? Questions come in. What does your watch mean? I'll tell you about that here in a second. When will we be doing these things? There's a note there that says no dates. We'll talk about why that is here in a minute. What steps in planning make this happen? We'll talk about that. What order do these need to be completed in? We'll talk about that. Wonder how many students will succeed or will they immediately shut down? We'll talk about that. How will everyone be accountable? We'll talk about that. All awesome questions, and you're all hitting on the great principles of design when that goes on. So this is our introductory module. So let's talk about some of the things that you're wondering about, some of the things that I have in here. So this start here module, just so you know, I'm in an instructor view right now. I'm not in student view. So when students first come in, they go ahead and just get access to that very first thing, that start here. Until they've watched that start here interactive video, and it's basically a PowerPoint that I put together. I put my voice over it, and then they have to watch it. It doesn't show them the remainder of those things there. And they get from an introductory email from me, they go ahead and get that says, you've got to watch this here. And then it's going to give you 3 chunks of information before the first assignment and when it's due. So if you look down here, you'll see that we had a deadline of May 15th and May 11th based on what was going on there. You'll see that there's multiple formats going on here. So if they don't get it here, they can read about it here and here, or they can also interact with me in a synchronous session via Zoom. So they get all 3 ways to interact with that content. And what we found from the research is that we have to have that communication piece in there, because if not, they will shut down automatically. So that's why we do these 2 communication pieces there. From a planning standpoint, it actually takes some time to go ahead and do that. So if I click on this here, you'll see that we've gone ahead. Here's how to get in contact with me. And then here's all the information on how to communicate with other students. Hopefully that will come back up. Talk about netiquette, how to get other people, how to earn full credit, so forth and so on. And what we found through our own research and through our feedback with both graduate students, undergraduate students, and K through 12 students, that that's hugely important. The next question becomes is, how do we hold everybody accountable? This introductory discussion that's here tells me that, as well as their progression in the LMS tells me how far they've gone. And so when this goes live, and this course went live on May, I think it was 6th this year, maybe it was May 5th. By May 7th, if they haven't gotten through those first 2 points, we go ahead and start to talk to them about that. We also go ahead and put all of these things in here in the logical order so it progresses. So they're going to start with communication. They're going to talk about course expectations. They're going to talk about their evaluation components, and then how to actually go ahead and work through different things and how that's going to work. We also learned very quickly from our research that this whole section called tips from former students is huge. And these are tips from former students about the course. They're not and about the content. It's not about how to go ahead and actually like navigate the course. These are tips in terms of the curriculum that's going on in that case. And so those are some of the things that happen. To set all of this up, it basically takes, about a day or so to really think through what it is that students are actually trying to think about. Now you'll notice, well, wait, how did you get the tips from former students at the beginning? When we first ran this course, we didn't have those things there. Those were the things that we learned after as it was going forward. So that's just some of the pieces and parts that we start to get at as we start to look at the big principles that are going on. Without us going into another module and doing the same thing, an actual learning module, as you can see on the screen, is set up almost exactly the same way. There's some type of overview that goes on, just like in the last one. I had an overview for the whole course. Here I have an overview for the module. It exists in two formats. They can get it PowerPoint-wise, they can read it, and that's really one of our important design pieces and parts. They have all of the reading and things that they're going to do next. And then one of the design principles that we've learned about is that there has to be multiple ways to engage with that content. So in this particular unit that we have going on, this is a school law class. They're learning about rights of students in this module. So we have things related to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and they get access to that not only from video, if you can see there, we've got a video that's going on there. They have access to the information through discussion board. They have access to the information through integrated PowerPoints. They have access to the information through PDFs and readings, and then they actually have access to it via textbook as well too that we've provided for them to go ahead and support that. And so that's one of our biggest pieces and parts that we've learned through this process, is that you have to go ahead and make things accessible in multiple formats. And so the reason I started with that quick little activity is because that demonstrates the 4 principles we're going to be working through as we go through. So just to kind of briefly remind you, we're looking at these avenues of research: the moves in formative assessment, making thinking visible, and digital assessment. And so just to kind of take that first activity and kind of think it through, I did a formative assessment, or a check on where you're at in your learning steps right now, just by asking you to share out those items. You put them in the chat box for me. You told me what you were seeing and what you weren't seeing. If there were certain things that the group didn't bring up, those were things I was going to have to make sure I mentioned to make sure we were all kind of on the same page. We did a making thinking visible routine, which are the ways that go ahead and support students' acquisition of learning. We know that in online courses, students get lost. That's clear from research day in, day out. The question becomes is, how do you get them to show you what you know? And that, what do you see? What do you wonder? That's one of those techniques, and we'll talk about that. And then from there, we move it into a digital assessment world. In this case, I did one and the same. I did the moves in assessment by going ahead and having you put that in the chat box, but you also showed me what you knew by typing that in the chat box as well too. And that's one way we can start to get students to interact. Why that becomes important is that we have to really think about that. We go ahead and we design courses, but we have to plan for these additional things as well too. And that's what's really going to move us forward. So if, just to summarize that, the things that we should be seeing is that we should see multiple formats of information. We should see communication tips. Technical skills need to be there. Tips from students. Layout explanation. So I laid out how the course is going to work, how the textbook is going to work. There's a focus on interaction in each module. Those are the things that kind of come from that. And if you're unfamiliar with that checklist, these come from the standards for evaluation by the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, which is called INACOL. They have 2 sets of standards. There's one for K-12, there's one for higher education. They're pretty much the same. If you click on that hyperlink, it will take you to that website, and it basically brings you to what do you have to think about as you're designing a course, whether that's for K-12 or whether that's for higher ed. And so what we just looked at meets all of those standards that are there. At the same time, if you don't want to read a whole bunch of standards, we have the Quality Matters organization, which works with INACOL, and they've taken those standards and they've basically put them into a checklist format, a rubric, if you will, to go ahead and start to tell you, are you on point with the things that are going on in your course? So the course that I just shared with you is my school law class that I teach at the graduate level. And that course is Quality Matters approved. It meets all of the requirements that need to happen in terms of what's going on in the day-to-day operations of an online course. And so that's kind of our introductory piece. So I'm going to pause there because I've already talked for at least 10 minutes. And so my question is going to be for you is feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to put some questions in the chat box. What do you want to know right now just based on that part? And then we'll go in a little bit farther. So I see Darnice has asked, has this method been applied to teaching a math class? Absolutely it was. I taught math when I was a classroom teacher. Now I'm an administrator. We were using the same principles back then as we're using now. One of the things that I will give you as an additional hint is it's really helpful if you have some type of Surface or an iPad where you can have a stylus so you can demonstrate those math problems in some of those live synchronous sessions as well too, but the same thing appears. I actually think it's easier in math than some of the other content areas I work with just because of the fact that math tends to be a linear progression as opposed to kind of a more, I guess, a juxtaposed holistic approach like in language arts. What other questions or thoughts? How long does it take to prepare this course if you're starting from nothing developed? So my course is developed into modules. And so each module is based on how long the syllabus takes. So I figured to produce one module, it's taken me about maybe 1 to 2 hours per module. And oftentimes that's a question of, am I really familiar with the content or not? When this course was developed, even though I'm a practicing school administrator and do work with school law all the time, this was new content and the fact that I had to organize it in a way for students to work with. So the first time I taught it, which was in right before pre-COVID, probably took me closer to 3 hours to just get the content up there. But in terms of the organization, once you develop the rhythm and you go down that Quality Matters resource, it really goes pretty quick because it follows the same way in each of them. There's always some introduction, multiple ways to engage with the content, the evaluation component when it's all said and done. How long does a module take for a student to go through on average? So when we're talking K through 12, our modules are based on our units on courses of study. So in my district, we have defined units for every course, and it just depends on what the course is. So each unit becomes a module when it's all said and done. So to give you an example, my language arts team, grades 6, 7, and 8, one of their units takes them about 6 weeks. So that's worth one module, and they break it up into components within each of those weeks. Like some of my math units, those are closer to 3 or 4 weeks. So that becomes a module. At the graduate level in my graduate class, each segment of the course is considered one module. We have 5 modules in that course. In my undergraduate course, that course is built up into 8 modules because each module is roughly 2 weeks. And so in my case, as Kay is asking, my modules are referred to as unit or topic. And some students do prefer to have it organized by week or class day, and that's exactly where the module comes in. So I'm going to minimize this just to show that for you because you're right, Kay. At the collegiate level, they do prefer dates. So you'll see in this module here, actually, let's go to the module we're working on right now. So this is the module that they're starting this week. I'm in the instructor view, so I can see everything. When they first get into that module, because it's adaptive release, they have to finish module 2 before they can go into module 3, and they have to get feedback from me. They're going to get access to those 2 items. They review those, then they'll go to those 2, then it'll give them access to all of these things. And you'll see that they're organized by date in here. So they can only see the stuff that's due this week through June 27th right now. They can only see the stuff that's due next week for July 3rd at that time. But all of these together connect from a curricular standpoint. And so what we found from the research is it's clear to have clear learning goals for this. And so each module essentially becomes the learning goal. They know what the learning goals are because they're listed in the syllabus, and they're also, I have them here within each module overview. And the module overview tells them what we're working on, how to read, how to interact with the content, what our learning goals are, what the assignments are, helpful tips from me, and helpful tips from former students. And that gives them the ability to do that. So you asked, Darnice, what program enables you to do adaptive release? Well, in this case, I'm just using Canvas because that's what the university provides for me. At Kent State, where I teach as well too, I use Blackboard. When I'm in the district, we use Google Classroom, all of those different things. And so they pretty much all do the same thing. It just depends on what you have available to you. If I have a preference of learning management system, I like Canvas. It's probably because I know it the best. I think it looks a little cleaner than Blackboard does when it's all said and done. But for K through 12, I really like the Google Classroom, and maybe that's partly because it syncs with all of our textbooks at the end of the day. So it really comes down to a preference. They all pretty much do the same thing. And we found doing research across different areas that they all seem to, do the same features. It's just a question of workflow. I know that in Canvas, how to click here, and that brings me to this screen, where if in Blackboard, I have to click over there and it brings me to the same screen. It's just a workflow issue when it's all said and done. So that being said, these are pretty much the go-tos when it's all said and done. But we've learned, and I'm sure you've had experiences with those, I can do all those things, but it doesn't guarantee that the students are going to learn. So the question becomes is, what do we do to start to increase that? And this is where those pieces of research start to intersect. So if you're following along in the presentation, I'm going to come back to slide 6, but I'm going to jump to 7. And what we found is that we have to do all of those basic technical things that we just talked about. But at the same time, we have to intersect on these 3 things. We have to focus on visible thinking routines, and we'll talk about that. We have to capitalize on the formative assessment cycle, and we'll talk about that. And then we have to function through this idea of apps. And the reason I'm coming back to that slide is this. So you may be familiar with this article, the Association for the Supervision of Curriculum Development back in April put together the types of instruction that happen. And they created that first column, and they kind of defined the second column, and I've since modified the second column. These are things that happen in a classroom. You have direct instruction, teachers model things, you have discussions, you have videos, you have review, assessment, so forth and so on. And what we noticed during COVID and what we've noticed pre-COVID is that teachers try to automatically create those things in the online environment. And those are good things to create. The question becomes, how do you do that? And that functions through this definition of apps. So I'm going to jump here for a second, and you will see that I've got this slide here that's called apps. And so one of the things that we found in order to motivate students, in order to get them to function forward, is we have to think about the technology we're using in those online courses differently. We just can't go ahead and say we're going to use this tool or that tool. We have to use tools that meet these components. And we kind of made it into an acronym for our teachers as well as for our own research purposes. So it has to be a technology that acquires meaningful content standards. That means we have to use the technology to learn the content. It's not just a glorified secondary worksheet when it's all said and done. If any of you are familiar with the SAMR model, we're talking about making those at the M&R levels when it's all said and done. It has to be something that helps them proceed through proficiency. It has to be something that progresses through meaningful feedback, and it has to be something that supports a student in rigorous thinking. If it doesn't meet those 4 components, it doesn't work in the online environment. You'll get some gain, but you're not going to get the full gain when it's all said and done. So going back to my slide 6, these are the tools that we figured out in relationship to the types of things that we do in courses that we can really use to do that. And they all meet that definition of apps. So if we want to do direct instruction on something, we're going to use Screencastify to provide a lecture, a mini lesson. And I will take you through some of these tools here in a minute. If we want to model something, we probably want to use Pear Deck or AWeB. If we want to do a discussion, we're going to use Google Classroom or back channel chat, or if we're in an LMS, we might use the discussion tool. If we're doing video, we want to use Edpuzzle so that kids are engaged with that. If we're brainstorming, we're going to try a Padlet. If we're going to review, we're going to do a form or Mentimeter. We need cooperative learning groups, we're going to use a breakout feature. We want to do the assessment, we're going to use a free program called EdSite or use a self-grading Google quiz. We want to do reflection, then we need Poll Anywhere. And what we've learned is that we need all of those things. I need direct instruction, I need discussion, I need video, I need review, I need assessment, I need reflection in all of my modules. So if we were to go back and look at my big giant list there in my module, you would see that I have all of those things, not necessarily in one single module, but they're there throughout the course. So Kate's asking the question, which of these apps are free and which cost. The cool part is everything I'm going to show you today is free. I will not show you anything that costs. Now with that, some of these do have upgrades. So for example, Padlet, you get a free one, you get about 5 access to that. If you need more than 5, you have to pay a small cost for that if you want to go above and beyond that. In my world, most of my teachers only teach 5 classes, so I'm in business with that. I will also tell you that all of these things, if you're in the K through 12 world, these are all SIPA and COPA compliant. If they don't meet SIPA or COPA, or your students can't be on it legally. And so as a result, we double check that for us in these particular cases. So that's one of the pieces and parts we have to look at. The other piece and part we have to think about is that we need these thinking routines, because as you know, and as I know, students can read, but they don't necessarily learn. And so as a result, we have to think about what that looks like. And so all of these tools that we've just talked about in relationship to the definition of apps requires students to build explanations and interpretations. It requires them to reason with evidence, requires them to make connections, consider different viewpoints. And at the bottom of all of this is it allows them to transfer knowledge, because I've sat through online courses and I've read everything and I've done everything. And then you ask me a week later and there's nothing I can do with it. Well, by using these pieces and parts through the apps definition in the learning management system with those principles, we've learned very quickly that students can go ahead and start to transfer that knowledge. So these thinking routines come from Ron, Richard, and colleagues. They're professors at the University of Harvard. They have an institute called the Thinking Visible Institute. And what's cool is all of their things are free. They're listed there on the screen for you. You can click on those links here. You don't have to now, because we're going to demonstrate some of them. What allows us to go through these is that this first link is this routine brings you to this chart, which shows you all of the different things. And the chart works like this. If you want students to describe something or interpret something, you want to use this tool, and then it gives you an example of how to use it. There's a summary which basically summarizes the research behind this, and there's videos showing teachers actually using these. Some of them are in online environments, some of them are in the actual classroom, so you can check out to see how teachers are doing these and how they've converted them, and I'll show you some of these as we go forward. But that's not enough. As I mentioned to you, there's 3 parts to all of this. We have to have apps. From there, we have to go ahead and make sure we have these thinking visible routines, but we also have to look at this from the instructor cycle, and we have to think about this from a formative assessment cycle. So Suzanne, you just asked a question. Am I sharing the PowerPoint so we can have access to the links? Absolutely, I am. That link is right here on the first slide here. It's tinyurl.com/Drost online learning. Feel free to go ahead and copy that link, and you'll get access to the presentation. And with that, it brings us to this concept of how do we look at this in the classroom? Because as we know, kids go into those classrooms, but they don't automatically necessarily learn. So we have to think about what that looks like. And so through 2 colleagues of mine, Dale Whittington and Donna Snodgrass, we created this visual a few years ago to reconcile or explain how we have to think about this in the online classroom as well as the regular classroom. So when we're thinking about instruction, and I mentioned this in my LMS design, I have to start with the possible learning targets. I have to know what those are from the beginning. If I don't know, I'm not sure where to go with different things. Then by doing those other things we talked about, I've got students that actively engage. Then from there, I, as the classroom teacher, I start to collect evidence and I start to make decisions. Are students on target? Are they not on target? And that starts me through that process again. If I do just one of these things, just the assessment cycle, I've lost something. I don't have the engagement that I need in an online class. I have to couple that with my definition of apps that looks like this. I have to go ahead and use those thinking routines, which we'll talk about here again in a minute, and then I have to couple it with that cycle. And that's what starts to move students forward when those things are all said and done. So I know that was a lot of talking, but I want to actually make it show you and tell you what it looks like in action. So we're going to start with this one. So maybe you're familiar with Padlet, maybe you're not. I've designed each of these slides in the following format. It gives a little definition of what the tool is. We're going to play with an example, and then here's the instructions below if you want to recreate what I've created before. And remember, they're all free, so you can go ahead and create the exact same thing that's there. So if we're looking at this in terms of what goes on in the classroom in the online cycle, we have to have an understanding from the instructor standpoint of what formative assessment is. And for our purposes, it's basically any activity that a classroom teacher does in order to make instructional adjustments. So I do something, kids respond, and I either figure out they've got it or they don't have it. And then based on that, what am I going to do next? So what I'm going to ask you to do is go ahead and click on this Padlet link that's right there. It says padlet.com/drostbr/FA, and it's going to bring you to a page that looks like this. You know you're in the right spot because there's all kinds of things that are going on. You get little boxes and things of that nature. So this one here is from my assessment class. These are student responses, all different things. And what's cool about this is you can embed videos, you can embed cartoons, you can just put in text, you can do pretty much anything you want to go ahead and respond to people. This one's open to the World Wide Web, so anybody who has this link can go ahead and add to this Padlet. For our purposes today, I'm going to ask you to just take a minute because we've talked a little bit about some things. You're going to go over to the right-hand corner where there's a plus sign, and it's going to bring you a box somewhere on the screen. I'm going to ask you to type your initials, so I'm going to do mine. And I'm going to put next to it HC so that I know this is from Hiram College, because when I'm done with this one today, I'm going to delete these comments. I'm going to ask you to just talk real briefly about what's formative assessment from your perspective. I gave you a brief definition, but I want to know, what are your thoughts on formative assessment? So take a minute, add a post to that, and you'll see that it's live because it's going to go ahead and start to move around on the page. You'll start to see we've got all kinds of things coming up there. It's a live page. All right, so we've got some tools there. And this is where what we generally do in classrooms, and oftentimes we stop there. And this is what I'm here to tell you in the presentation about, is that if we just stop there, we've lost something. And this is what makes the difference for our online learners. So we're going to pretend that we were in a module. I just spent some time interacting with content. You read something, you watched a video on formative assessment, and now I'm asking you to go ahead and type some information to show me what you know, your assessment, if you will. What we've learned from the research is we just can't stop there. We have to insert these concepts of thinking visible routines. So what we would do next is I would ask you to go ahead and take a look at that Padlet. It could be your response. It could be somebody else's response. And I would ask you to either write on an index card, a post-it note, chat it out in the chat box, whatever you would like. We're going to use the chat box for our purposes today. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and I want you to find one of those spots on there. And you're going to explain that from the perspective of one of these people. You could explain it from the perspective of a teacher, a researcher, a professor, a director, a superintendent, a parent, or a student. Now, if we were in the LMS, I would put you in specific groups. For our purposes today, I'm not going to throw you into breakout rooms. I'm just going to ask you to type in the chat box. You're going to type in the chat boxes, I am thinking of formative assessment from the perspective of, and you'll choose one of those. Then from there, you're going to describe that item that you find on from that viewpoint. So you're using what's on the Padlet as evidence. And then from there, you ask a question or concern. So if I was doing this, I would say this: I am thinking of formative assessment from the perspective of a teacher. And I write that into the box. Then I would say, I think from a teacher's perspective It gives me the opportunity to make instructional adjustment. A question I have is, should it be graded? That's what that looks like. All right, so I'm going to give you guys a minute. Find a spot on that Padlet to go ahead and choose a spot and then choose your perspective. Type that out into the chat box. We'll give you a minute or two to do that, and then we'll explain to you why we're doing it in that manner and setup. So I got one in there from Tamara who says, I think from the perspective of a student, I think from the student's perspective, it tells me that it's just not about tests and homework assignments that matter. My teachers is always alert to what I'm doing. It's a fabulous point of view that's going on for it. And that's what starts the discussion and the richness of what needs to happen in terms of learning. I've got another one that says in there, a checkpoint on the road to learning to see what path to take next. From the viewpoint of the student, I get the ability to check in with myself. A question, how much time will I have? These types of thinking pieces start to push the conversation, and we start to get into the nitty gritty of concepts. The reason why we go ahead and do that is if we had just stopped with the Padlet, you could have typed yours in. I would have given you the points at the end of the day, but I have no idea if you understand what's going on. It isn't until you choose something else that you start to get that understanding and you're motivated to continue. We could do this in the chat box, and now you guys could start to respond to each other's questions. We could turn that into a discussion board and we could make it that way. So we've got all kinds of different ways to start to really think about those pieces and parts. Why that becomes important is from the instructioner standpoint, I now have the ability to look at what you're doing from the formative assessment standpoint. I can go ahead and start to probe into answers. I can go ahead and pose additional questions. I can prepare groundwork that's going on. I can start to tag different responses to clue students in that might be off task. I have a quick way to sample different responses to make sure that the entire class is on there. And that's what really moves us forward to what we're asking for, is to make student thinking visible in an online course, to connect the instruction and assessment, and then from there to really make sure that they're learning. That's how that kind of works. And so we've got other comments that are going in. I have about 10 minutes left, so I want to show you just a couple of other tools that work from the exact same perspective. So here's another one. This is called back channel chat. We're not going to click on this one. But what basically happens is that it brings you the ability to chat while a video is playing. So I have a video here that we could go ahead and watch. And what we do in online courses, we post videos all the time. We expect students to go ahead and watch them. The question is are they understanding the content that's going on? In this particular case, what we've learned is this creates basically a chat box that as students are watching the video, it'll prompt them with questions. It will also go out and allow them to interact with other students. And so when that's all said and done, I've gone through and I've interacted with other people. I don't know if I've learned anything yet. We enter into another routine. The routine becomes the headline routine. We ask students to go back through that transcript and go ahead and start to find out is what headline would you use that captures the important ideas or aspects of that chat. In other words, take everything that you've seen in less than 125 words. What's the summary of that's going on? And that starts to push students to that level that they're not only engaging with the material, they're interacting with other people, but I, as the instructor, can start to see where there's falls or loopholes or things that we don't understand. And then I can make my instructional adjustments that's going on there. We've got another one that comes up. This one is called Active Prompt. When you go to the website, it looks like it's from 1990. It is from 1990. It's an oldie and a goodie. It was made by the federal government, but it's a fabulous, quick little tool. And it starts by asking students to look at some type of visual. So I'm going to pull mine up here real quick. If any of you are familiar with the Ohio Teacher Evaluation System, I'm one of the state trainers, so this is one that I used in a state training this week. We went ahead and we were looking at the different elements that are going on. And I asked teachers to go ahead and find a word, a sentence, and a key idea related to that. And they have the ability to move this dot to where the key part is. So now I've got interaction that's going on. From my end as the classroom teacher, I can see who's moving the dot where based on my questions. It can be synchronous or it can be asynchronous. It just depends on how you want that to work. I, as the classroom teacher, have interacted with you. You have interacted with your peers. And then from there, I've got evidence to go ahead and make some instructional decisions when it's all said and done. And that's what makes the difference. I use this tool oftentimes with screenshots. So students will be reading a section of a PDF, or they might be going ahead and reading the textbook. And I'll screenshot that section and I'll ask them to go ahead and find that piece. And then they drag their dot there. And then I see where all the dots are at in the class. They see where all the dots are at in the class. And then they can start to have discussions with that. So Kay writes, I would like to see you using this in a real class setting. Okay, let's do it. And yes, Kay, you can assign different dots to each student. So I'm going to ask you to all click on that right now. Oh, and the one before as well too. Okay, we can try that real quick if we have time. I'm going to ask you to all click on the PowerPoint slide that brings you to this one right here. Go ahead and move your dot somewhere on there. Just find a word that's interesting to you, and I'm going to go ahead and log in so Kate can see what's going on. So I'm in my instructor view right now. I got to find you on the list here. You're somewhere here. There we go. And so I used this earlier in the week. That's where all of my participants put their information. And so you may see your dot there. We just went from 85 to 86. So I know somebody just moved a dot. If I had this in my classroom viewer in the LMS, I can hover over that dot and know exactly who moved that dot. For our purposes of today, I just know that there are dots there because I didn't have you log in or do anything like that. You can go ahead and make any type of, you can send kids with multiple dots, you can do different shapes, you can do different images. For my math teacher in the audience, my math teachers and myself, we use it for coordinate planes all the time. If you're a world language teacher, I use it for infographics all the time. We have kids find vocabulary words, main ideas, supporting detail. Same thing in language arts. You can use it with pretty much anything that's an image, and you can always take an image with your phone or with your screen capture tool. So you've got all kinds of different options that are going on there. That's kind of how that one works. I'm going to go ahead and talk about two more quick little tools as we wrap up here, and then okay, if we've got time, I'll go back to that other one just to share you with that. So my next one is called dot storming. If you're not familiar with this tool, it's a great tool, and where people stop is they just have kids go ahead and choose ideas. And basically what happens is your job is on the website is you throw out an idea and kids start to vote. So it tugs back and forth on the idea and what's the stronger. So think of it as Facebook and you're liking a post when it's all said and done. So if you were to click on that link, it's going to bring you to this slide right here. Eventually it will load. And you'll see that this is one we actually use in our science classroom. This is about nuclear power, is it safe? And we had students start to go ahead and supply reasonings. And this turned into a discussion writing activity. Every participant gets 3 or 4 votes, and it starts to show you how the participants are viewing different topics. But then you can turn it into that perspective activity to go ahead and make it a way to go ahead and write something. So we turn this into an argumentative essay that we put in the LMS. So kids had to decide whether nuclear power is safe or not. So which reasons convince them or not. The thinking visible piece of this is coming from the tug of war piece, where they go ahead and identify 2 opposing sides of the dilemma, and then they generate 2 or 3 tugs by voting on those to determine the strength of ideas. Which one is going to convince their reader more? That's kind of how that works when it's all said and done. To make that, you just go to the website, you literally type in the title, and then participants can supply their own reasonings when it's all said and done. Last tool I want to tell you about is the glorified escape room thing, and this is a really cool tool. It's called Flippity. It's also free. We use this with my graduate students all the time. It's a really interesting way to get them through content. It's as simple as making a Google spreadsheet. Those are pictures of my students and actually one of my 3rd grade classrooms actually working on one of these. This one we did in February, right before we went on lockdown. So it's something you can use live as well as in the classroom. And basically what happens is you go to the website, you go ahead and you create the free account and asks you to type in your questions. And then it puts in this nice lockbox form. We did this one as a reading activity, so they had to read the story, and then when they click on it, it goes ahead and asks them questions. Some we did multiple choice, some we did short answer. And until they get the right answer, it won't unlock them. I'm not sure what the answer is. Okay, we'll see in this case. And it'll get them through and gives them feedback. Some questions, if I can find one, are open-ended. Some are, different manners. And the goal is to get them through that. Then from there, you can plug in videos that they can interact with, so forth and so on. So Mrs. Paul is the classroom teacher, so we had them watch this video of the story they read, and then they had to go ahead and talk about the differences between the story and the video. We did the same thing online in my graduate student class. I had them watch a video about one perspective about student law. They read a textbook article about another student law. They came to this. They go ahead and interacted for those items when it was all said and done. So last thing I just wanted to quickly mention is that this is all based on research. There are research on each of these individual tools and how they're used in the classroom. I've got a tiny URL down there that you can go ahead and access that. You can see this from the thinking visible routine as well as the formative assessment piece from this article as well too. If you click on those, it will bring you to those pieces and parts. So I believe that I have two different 2 minutes left. So I'll use that time to answer questions, but let me grab a couple that are in the chat box. So with that, Harley, you were asking, what are the 2 organizations that mention apps or online tools are approved by? It's not that they're approved by, it's that if you are using the federal funding in your school district, which I'm sure you are in order to access things, you have to comply with these 2 laws. And those 2 laws are called CIPA, C-I-P-A, and COPPA, C-O-P-P-A. And those require you to have certain protections in place. For example, most apps out there do not allow students under the age of 13 to go ahead and sign up for an account. So you can't do that. So you have to check with those different things. What other questions do we have from folks? I know that's a lot in 50 minutes. My pleasure to share with you, Tamara or Tamara. Glad to share with you, Suzanne. It's in this format. It's not a Google because it's a permalink, but if you go ahead and pull that first link that's there, it'll allow you to download it when it's all said and done. And then you can click on the links if you'd like. If not, shoot me an email and I'm happy to go ahead and share that with you. I'll also put my email address up here if anybody wants to go ahead and contact me afterwards as well too. That will adjust on your screen at some point in time because it is live. You can reach me out there if you have additional questions. So, Kay, up on your screen there, you should have a little option to download. I'm in the live view, so I don't know if it will allow me to download on my screen, but there should be a little thing next to the word collaborate that allows you to download it. If not, again, this is a permalink, so you can always go directly to that spot. And you can also do a file and print as a PDF as well, too.